You know, there was an old movie, I forgot what the name of it was. It was a really old movie, and it had, I think it was Jimmy Stewart in it, and he was playing the husband, and the wife was religious. He wasn't. And anyway, it came time to eat, and he started to eat without saying a blessing, and she kind of cleared her throat, and he realized he was supposed to bless the food. And so anyway, in this movie, he prayed this prayer, something like, God, this is what I worked for. I planted it. I cleared the field. I did this, but thank you anyway. Amen. And you could tell it was him basically saying that he didn't acknowledge God. He said, this is all my work. But it's God who made all of the laws that allow a seed to be put in the ground. You take this little tiny seed and you plant it in the dirt and give it time, give it some water, and it'll produce all of this fruit and stuff. That couldn't happen if it wasn't God. God's the one that set all of these things in motion. So even though you're doing the work, it's God that is actually making it work. You could compare this to us. You may be working 40 hours a week, or you could be working 60 hours a week, and you could sit there and say, this is my money. I earned this. I worked for this. But God's the one that gave you the freedom to have a job. There's places on this planet that you don't have that freedom. Our ancestors fought and bled and died and gave us this freedom. God worked through them. It's God that has given us the ability. It's God that made us live in the most prosperous time in the history of the world. It's God who gave you whatever talents that you have. It's God that gave you the ability to think and to work and to give you strength. Whether you realize it or not, God is the source of your prosperity. So how is it that you acknowledge God as your source and you really trust in Him? Even though you're still working, how is it that you see Him as your source? You know how you do it? You take one day out of 7 off. And when God gave this command to Moses, that's one of the 10 commandments, is to not work on the Sabbath, but to take the day off. Did you know when God gave that command to Moses, there was no nation on the planet where people took one day out of 7 off. Man, they were working 7 out of 7 days trying to grub out a living and to make ends meet and things like this. And to have the Jews come along and just take one day out of 7 off, how in the world are you going to prosper? How can you compete with the other people that are working 7 out of 7 days? You know how you did it? Because God blessed the work of your hands. And those people, those Jews, prospered more in 6 days than all of the nations who worked 7 days. And so it was a testimony to them that even though you're doing something, it's not you that's making this happen. It's God's grace, and your work just is appropriating the blessing that God has already given you. And in case anybody missed that and didn't see it one day out of 7, here in Leviticus 25, those verses that I read, God is telling you to take 1 year out of 7 years off. Now, in case you missed the 1 day out of every week off, how could you miss that if you take 1 year off and you can't plant any crops and the stuff that grew of itself, you couldn't go harvest it, you couldn't do any work in the 7th year. You had to take an entire year off. How could you survive? It goes on to say that the way this happens is that God would bless the 6th year and you would have 3 times a normal harvest. And that would carry you through the 6th year, through the 7th year, and through the 8th year while you're planting the crops and waiting for them to come up. And so just like clockwork, on the 6th year, you would have 3 times a normal harvest. And all of this was to show that, see, yes, you're working. Yes, you plant the fields. Yes, you plow. Yes, you reap. But it's God that gives the increase. God is your source. That's what the Sabbath was all a picture of. And if you go back to Hebrews chapter 4, where I was reading, and it was talking about that there is a rest that is left for us, and it likened it to a Sabbath rest. This is what the Old Testament Sabbath was making a picture of. That we need to recognize that even though we do things, we still study the Word, we still live holy, we still go to church, we still pay our tithes, we still do what's right. It's not our doing that makes the increase. It's God's blessing. And all we're doing is responding to God. See, this is illustrating what I've been trying to say here for 3 weeks, talking about living in the balance of grace and faith. We still work, but it's God. We are resting in Him. We aren't working and trusting our own effort. Even though we are putting forth effort, it is our faith in what God has done, and our effort is all a response to Him, not something we do to get a response to Him. And so it says right here in verse 9, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9, there remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. A relationship where you are just resting in what He has already done instead of you doing something, trying to earn and get Him to move. There is labor to that. You know, there were so many pictures of this in the Old Testament, but one of the pictures, even among the priests, was that they had to wear this linen, and the whole purpose of it was that when they went into the tabernacle and into the temple to do their service, it was to eliminate sweat. That's the reason that all of these commands about the certain garments that they had to wear and stuff, and they had to cleanse themselves. It was so that they wouldn't sweat, which implied labor. When you entered into the very presence of God, you couldn't come in with your own effort. It had to be you just simply obeying and doing what He told you to do, and you are responding to Him. He is not going to respond to you. I could go into a lot more detail on that, but there was just so many things in the Old Testament that pictured this same thing.